Hi there. Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, good morning for some of you. Welcome to the 2021 Federal Funding Landscape webinar. My name is Megan Blondin. I'm the Executive Director here at Youth Collaboratory. I have been working as an applicant to the federal government for the last 20 years or so. I've been a reviewer for the federal government for the last 19 years. And here at Youth Collaboratory have been doing this webinar and exposure to federal funding for at least the last decade or so. Presenting with me today is Chris Fisher. Chris, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Fisher. I'm the founder and principal with Spinnaker Government Relations. I specialize in providing professional advocacy services for the social impact not-for-profit sector, and I've been working with Youth Collaboratory for the last 5, 6, however many years. We've been fortunate to work together.
That is true. Chris is always the best part of our federal funding presentations. So you're in for a treat today. I know that there are a number of you who are on the webinar today that are a little less familiar with Youth Collaboratory. So I'm just going to take a moment to do 2 slides here, about 2 minutes on who we are for those of you who are less familiar with us. So Youth Collaboratory works with the youth services community to innovate, evaluate, and drive effective strategies, ultimately focusing on assuring that young people are safe and well and unlocking their limitless potential. As a national network, this slide gives you a little bit of an idea when it comes to our reach. So annually, we're connecting with just over 18,000 individuals every year, providing training and consulting services to about 3,000 of those individuals. And we tend to attract the innovators in the field to our membership, which is primarily where we do or concentrate our work related to research and innovation. Currently, we provide subgrants to 64 of those members across 36 states throughout the US to support that continued research and innovation. So today's webinar Great, thank you. Today's webinar is part of our training and consulting effort. So we are equipping organizations to access federal funding. Every year, we field a ton of questions from hundreds of organizations related to federal funding. And this webinar takes those most common questions and answer them specific to this year's federal funding. And at the end, we'll even talk a sneak preview of next year's federal funding. So there's 4 main areas we are going to address today. We'll begin by discussing the current federal budget, both a broad overview and then highlighting upcoming funding opportunities specifically. These funding opportunities are mainly going to be focused on opportunities for organizations that serve youth and families, because that is where our mission and services lie. Then we'll go into the estimated release dates for each federal agency, as well as talking through where the top pitfalls of applicants often lie and what are 3 strategies you can employ to address those top pitfalls. And then finally, we will end by talking briefly about what to expect in fiscal year 2022, and then move into a Q&A session. So we will end with Q&A, but please feel free to ask your questions throughout using the public chat box. So at the bottom of your screen, if you just, well, we all probably know how to use Zoom at this point, but at the bottom of your screen, scroll over chat, you can enter your questions right in there. So we'll pause occasionally to answer any questions that need to be answered verbally. And at the very end, if you want to ask your question live, you are welcome to do that as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris to start by walking us through federal funding for this year.
Thanks, Megan. So as Megan just outlined in our agenda, we're going to start by talking about outcomes for fiscal year 2021 federal funding, as well as the COVID relief to date. Then afterwards, we'll cover what to expect in this coming calendar year. Next slide when you get a chance, Megan. So a couple of quick overview terms and frame settings so that we are all on the same page for this discussion. The 2021 federal fiscal year began on October 1. However, funding for the 21 fiscal year was not finalized until just after Christmas. In that interim period between October 1 and December 27th, federal agencies operated under a temporary funding solution called the Continuing Resolution for Those Who Care, but in some cases that has delayed the release of some FY21 grants. Currently, federal agencies are releasing their FY21 grants while simultaneously Congress works on COVID relief, FY22 appropriations, and an economic stimulus and recovery package. And we're going to talk about those three big ticket items after we talk about FY21. Okay, a couple of key terms to keep in mind. Budget and appropriations are not the same thing. The public media will commonly confuse or interchange these two terms, but for our purposes in today's discussion, the budget is not the same as appropriations. The federal budget is most analogous to your credit card spending limit, whereas appropriations might be analogous to the act of actually charging your card for an expense. So the budget is the maximum amount of money that Congress allows itself to spend, while appropriations is the actual process where Congress gives money to the federal agencies. And that's a little bit of a key distinction, and we'll get to that in a bit more. And then lastly, another key term, president's budget. This is also often tossed around in the media, and it's important to know that the president's budget is not a real budget, but a request of Congress. The president has no ability to set the federal budget. He can only request it. The power of the purse remains solely in Congress's hands. All right, just a few more terms. Reconciliation, this is also in the media these days. The only thing you really need to know about it is that it's a process by which Congress can spend money, but not enact policy changes, and it doesn't require 60 votes in the Senate. Why that matters is that the Democrats have control of the Senate by only 50. There are only 50 Democratic members and a tie break by the vice president. And typically they would need at least 10 Republicans to support them, except if they use reconciliation. We'll again touch on that in a moment. And then COVID relief is what's currently being debated in Congress, particularly in the House. Appropriations, as I mentioned earlier, is the process by which Congress typically allocates money to governmental functions. You can think of appropriations as the process of keeping the lights on. And then finally, a stimulus bill. When we talk about stimulus bill in today's discussion, we're talking about an economic recovery and infrastructure package that will come in the near future, but is not yet fully defined. All right, outcomes on fiscal year 2021. So these were secured in calendar year 2020. Youth Collaboratory is very active in its advocacy and education of members of Congress around services for youth and families. Every year, Youth Collab's members help us identify what should be our priorities when it comes to funding. We have three top funding priorities. These are not our only public policy funding priorities, our only public policy priorities, but they are our top funding priorities. This year in FY21, we were successful in securing an increase for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program at the Department of Health and Human Services, an increase of $5 million, as well as an increase at the Youth Mentoring Grants at the U.S. Department of Justice, an increase of $3 million to a total of $100 million, as well as a sixth round of the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program of $82 million, an increase of $2 million over the last couple of rounds of YHDP. So pleased to see these increases in the regular FY21 appropriations process. This is not including any money that was plussed up through COVID, which we'll get to in a moment. A couple of other, and we're going to just sort of breeze through several slides here of tables of funding outcomes. These slides will be available at the end of today's discussion, so you can reference these again. The right-hand column is the FY21 final outcome. Those in green had increases, those in black were level, and those in red were reductions. I'd like to just highlight here the Runaway and Homeless Youth programs, of which there was an increase for both street outreach and basic centers, transitional living programs, and maternity group homes. You can see 20 million of that 137 million was allocated for street outreach. I should pause and say all these numbers are in millions. So when we talk about Head Start there, middle of the page, 10,784 million or $10.7 billion. So a couple of highlights from Health and Human Services. On the next slide, we'll see a couple of highlights from HUD. The homeless assistance grants received a moderate increase, of which 82 million went to the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program. Again, the 6th round of that funding, in which Youth Collaboratory was integral in helping to secure that, as well as a very modest increase to the Community Development Block Grant. Department of Justice, as we mentioned, an increase in youth mentoring grants, as well as Title V delinquency prevention, which funds a whole host of programs, grants for children exposed to violence, anti-trafficking, girls in the juvenile justice system, as well as the Youth Promise grants, Part B, state formula grants to improve juvenile justice systems, and then some increases for NCMEC and the missing and exploited children programs nationally. So again, modest increases across the board at the Department of Justice. Next slide. And then lastly, Department of Education. Again, consistent across the board increases for the education for homeless children and youth. This is ensuring that children who experience homelessness have access to public education. Increases, moderate increase for 21st century community learning centers, that's after school enrichment programs. Increases for the Title I grants to local education agencies, and then modest increases for TRIO and Gear Up, which are around helping individuals in low income communities succeed and excel in post-secondary and secondary and post-secondary education. And there are a number of programs at the Department of Education that are funded by that TRIO and Gear Up pots of money. And then finally, Department of Labor, WIOA, these are youth job placement, job training, job readiness programs. I'm sure everyone here or has at least heard of your WIA and workforce development boards. That is a $921 million in FY21, and modest increase for Youth Build, the pre-apprenticeship program, and reentry employment opportunities for adults and youth reentering from incarceration. Okay, when Congress gives money to the federal agencies, that doesn't just hand it over and say, you know, go forth and prosper. They include instructions. Some of those instructions are included in actual law, but more frequently there are instructions in what's called report language. And Youth Collaboratory has prioritized securing some report language on the programs we are most focused on, RI, YMG, and YHDP, to help ensure that the programs, that those funding is implemented in a manner that is most useful to folks in the field. So in RI, we were successful in getting some instructions from Congress around the prevention services and the eligibility of prevention services and anti-discrimination instructions. At the youth mentoring grants, we had focus from Congress on access for rural programs and youth exposed to substance abuse. And at YHDP, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, they received instructions around distribution of best practices, rural challenges, and coordinated entry. In the past on this webinar, we've taken a few minutes to go through how to use grants.gov to find currently available federal funding and forecasted federal funding. This year, because nobody wants to be on a Zoom longer than they have to be, we have tried to consolidate that process into our new federal grants page. And I believe Emily or one of my colleagues will be able to put this link into the chat because you can't click on it in Zoom. What this page has to offer is a how-to video on using grants.gov. If you're unfamiliar with grants.gov as a resource, this will hopefully be a good primer or a refresher, as well as links to the federal agencies' available funding opportunities for FY21. I encourage you to take a look at this page. It will hopefully be a one-stop shop to at least get you oriented to some new federal funding opportunities. Next slide. And I see one question that pops up that I'll just address, and I'm sorry, I can't monitor the chat entirely, but when will these instructions apply? These instructions apply to any of the FY21 dollars. When I was talking about those instructions 2 slides ago, as those FY21 dollars are rolling out through grants and contracts, they are supposed to abide by those instructions from Congress.
That does not mean that it will explicitly be stated in the funding announcement, although it may be integrated in some form or fashion, either in the funding announcement or in the back end. So these are instructions, but it does not mean, it does not directly translate verbatim to what will be placed into the funding announcements. The other thing that I would add to what Chris said around grants.gov, I know many of you utilize grants.gov to apply for federal grants, for those of you who are experienced in it. We were simply also pointing out here that you can use it to see forecasted announcements. All federal agencies are supposed to utilize grants.gov to show which funding announcements are forecasted to be released in the coming fiscal year. Some are more active in posting their forecasted opportunities than others. So here on this next slide, we've listed the estimated release dates for federal agencies that are primarily responsible for youth and family programming. So we've identified when we expect them to release their announcements, and we've hyperlinked each agency with the links on where you can find those forecasted announcements. In response to a previous question in the chat related to the slides, yes, these slides and this recording will be available afterwards, and so you can access those hyperlinks separately in that way. So for example, HHS typically releases their grants in late spring and early summer. And we provided a link to grants.gov to find their forecasted announcements and track the anticipated release dates, which can change at any time. As Chris said, these forecasted dates can be like a weather report. When sun is forecasted, be sure to bring your umbrella along with you. Anything can happen in that approval process, which can shift the dates that are it's forecasted to be released. So HUD is just starting their season for 2021. One thing to note here is that we expect there to be as many as 3 rounds of funding, rounds 4, 5, and 6, coming out this spring. Department of Labor typically begins in winter, and they have a number of announcements already released, as does Department of Justice. And we've provided links to both of those agencies in the PowerPoint where you can access those current open announcements. As I think Chris mentioned earlier, and certainly we put in the chat, if you are not already on our distribution list, go to our website and sign up for our email list if you would like to be notified as soon as these announcements are released. Also, Twitter and Facebook are probably the quickest way to get these announcements as they are released, and you can link to our Twitter and Facebook accounts on our website as well. Okay. Let me begin by asking this question. So how many of you plan on writing a federal grant or overseeing the writing of a federal grant this year? You can just click directly on your screen to answer that poll question. Do you plan on writing a federal grant or overseeing a federal grant this year? And if you are answering yes to that, or if you did answer yes to that, go ahead and give me some examples in the chat box of the programs that you intend to apply for. As you do that, I'm going to begin to go through the top pitfalls of applicants and the top three strategies that we've identified that you can employ to address those pitfalls and increase your competitiveness in applying for federal funding this year. I think I've mentioned earlier, we read hundreds of federal applications each year. And in this section, we've compiled 3 strategies that have had the biggest impact on an applicant's score from last year. So I'm going to work from the back to the front here, starting with the number 3 strategy. So the number 3 thing that you can do to increase your competitiveness is to get ahead of the release. So because we often don't know when the funding announcement is going to be released, what often happens is that applicants will wait until the release date to start their writing, right? Because anything could change in the funding announcement. While this is true, there is a federal grant writing season also. So multiple announcements are often released all around the same time, and waiting until they are released can often condense our deadlines or put a large demand in a very short period of time on our grant writers and even our program and finance staff. So to avoid this, we suggest getting ahead of the announcement. I think we're going to put the link here on our grant development work plan template. So this work plan template can be used to identify the various team roles, responsibilities, and expected turnaround, and identifying it in terms of what happens on day 1, what happens on day 2, what happens on day 5. Although you don't have dates because you don't know when it's going to be released, you can still create a structured plan and be sharing responsibilities across the multiple folks that are involved in getting these things together. The other thing we suggest to get ahead of it is to review prior funding announcements for consistencies in criteria. So oftentimes if you applied for a grant and received it, and then the next time you're writing is 3 years later, go back and look at the years from last year and the year before and see where there are consistencies that you can start writing for now. And if you, oftentimes your grant from 3 years ago would be out of date, so how can you strengthen what you wrote to address the consistent criteria that you have seen emerging over the last 2 years? And then the third thing is to update your materials now. Your logic model, your position descriptions, your work plan, your resumes, even your needs statement can all be compiled ahead of time and then tweaked after the funding announcement is released. Okay, so the number 2 strategy is to consider the criteria above all else. If you've participated in this webinar before, you've probably seen this strategy. It continues to be the number 1 pitfall, no matter how often we say this. And what happens here is that at times the applicant doesn't follow the criteria. Yes. Sometimes the funding announcements make no sense whatsoever in terms of the way the criteria flows, but that is the way that reviewers will read your grant. Their responsibility is to make sure that you're responding to that criteria. And so they're, in their mind, they're in some ways looking for to click off their checkbox. So if your information is not in that order, it can be difficult for them to find it, considering they're often reading thousands of pages at once. The other thing that happens is that folks can repeat criteria or omit a response, a direct response to the criteria. Oftentimes I find if, say, for example, the funding announcement asks how you integrate a trauma-informed approach, oftentimes if I can see a program or an applicant sort of dancing around the answer to that and not giving a very clear response to exact strategies that are being used that meet that criteria. So to avoid this, we recommend first following the criteria exactly. That includes the order of the criteria. Make sure that you don't just name it. Don't just say that you provide trauma-informed care, but explain it. Tell me how you provide it. Don't repeat back or regurgitate back the criteria, but explain it. And then the third piece is to ensure that every paragraph relates to the criteria, and it's your job to show reviewers how it is relevant to that particular criteria. If there's one thing I hate as a reviewer, it's having to read through multiple pages of information that I am not able to score you on. And then the third piece, the number 1 strategy for securing federal funding is to get an objective review of your proposal prior to it being submitted. So what often happens is that folks will rely on their previous performance. We received this grant 3 years ago. Of course, we will receive it again this year. The review panel that reviewed that grant 3 years ago, 100% will not be the review panel that's going to review your grant this year. So don't expect the same interpretation from what you wrote from year to year. So do not rely on your previous grant writing success, nor your previous performance. Reviewers don't actually see your monitoring reports. They don't actually talk to your program officers. Those are completely separate from the scoring that a reviewer would do. And then oftentimes folks will assume that the reviewer has a maybe more advanced knowledge or will be able to look things up online, for example. How do we avoid this? Number one, work to get an objective review prior to submission. So that's somebody who is not involved in your program. That's not your grant writer. That's not your program director. It's not anybody that actually knows your program. It is somebody who can be completely objective. And if you have the ability to, preferably have more than one person, right? Because we don't know who's going to be your reviewer. You want to make sure that you are getting different lenses or interpretations to your writing. And then if you really want to be efficient, engage a qualified reviewer, somebody who has experience for that federal department. The way that one agency does their review process is often different than the way another agency does their review process. Reviewers sometimes have more room or purview to be able to in the way that they discuss the grants and score the grants. So if you can find somebody who has that type of experience and will see it through that lens, all the more better. And I'm going to just offer 2 slides here for those of you that are new to Youth Collaboratory and the way that we can support you in that. And then I'm going to hand it back to Chris to talk about the to move on to the next piece here. So Youth Collaboratory offers a proposal review service to both members and non-members. In our process, we utilize expert federal reviewers who review a full draft of your proposal prior to you submitting it. So they objectively review it to see you've included requirements. They provide suggestions on how you can fully address those requirements. And all of our reviewers have some level of experience related to federal, state, or local competitions. So they know what they're looking for. We offer both single and double review options, double review giving you an opportunity to make changes prior to getting a second review. Double reviews are really only necessary for funding announcements that are incredibly competitive, where you really need to score as close to 100 as possible, or ones that are critical to the sustainability of your organization, right? So if that funding was lost, it would have a pretty strong impact on your organization's bottom line. So if any of you are interested in that, you can learn more here on our website by going to Grant Proposal Reviews. And here we've just quickly summarized what our success rate has looked like related to that proposal review success. So over the last few years, between 30 and 35% of runaway and homeless youth awardees under HHS have utilized these services. 100% of our double reviewed proposals have been funded in the past. 92% of the proposals we reviewed were funded, and 93% of organizations who used our services received at least one award. I think these numbers look impressive by themselves, but when you compare that to the percentage of organizations that had funding and then lost it, in some cases, those rates are more than 25%, and even as much as a 50% turnover in current grantees. When you compare those two, these success rates are pretty impressive. It's also why these services are in pretty high demand. So with all of that I said, if you are interested, I highly suggest signing up for that like today, we will have a wait list for most announcements by the time they are released by that agency. So what we do is when they're released, we set the final dates in order in which they were received, with our members receiving priority scheduling. So you can request now and then essentially get in the queue to choose your dates for proposal review once it is released. So to learn more about this service, that's all I'm going to say about it. You can go to our website. We also offer grant development coaching. So if you're newer, if this is a new funding source, we have a more intense process that we utilize, and you can go to our website to learn more about that. I'll note that it also includes a pretty hefty discount on doing a proposal review at the end of that process. And here are just a couple of webinars. You can also go to our website to see the webinars that we've prepared to support organizations who are applying for specific grants. These are just 3 of those grants. Okay, now that we know all about funding for this year and how to increase our ability to successfully secure that funding, I want to hand it back to Chris to talk about future funding. Before I do that, I want to pause and ask Shelley if there are any questions that came up that we should quickly address before we move on.
Thanks, Megan. We had a few questions here. For YHDP, will it be one NOFA to award 3 rounds of funding?
I don't know the answer to that question. My professional guess would be probably yes, but I don't have any insider intelligence to that.
How about any insider intelligence into changes or delays that can be expected because of the new administration?
This administration is moving pretty darn quick in terms of getting political appointees in place. And so I would, in general, there's a delay when there's a new administration. I wouldn't expect that delay to be too significant this year.
And related to that, HHS forecasted MGH FOA for RHY to be coming out in March of 2021. Has something come to your attention that leads you to believe that the release will be later in the spring or early summer?
At a minimum, I would say there's an administration turnover. And so those things often get slowed down before, if they haven't already been released, they often get slowed down in needing approval by the new administration prior to being released. That's not all of the time, but that is pretty standard.
And then the other one that is related to that is, with the new administration, do we expect any major changes to the funding announcements?
You know, I think if you look at the administration's priorities, you can get an idea of how those priorities might be integrated into a funding announcement. That is just a professional guess. So if there were to be changes, I would expect those changes to be aligned with the administration's priorities. And I think Chris has a resource later on at the end of this presentation that connects to that, or somewhere integrated in these slides. We'll point it out when it comes up.
Great. I'm just going to get these last couple here, and then we'll hand it back to Chris. Janice, yes, organizations. Well, Megan, how do you want to answer this one? Can organizations apply for both TLP and MGH in the same year?
The answer is yes. The requirements are that you are doing a different program or a different population within, or a different geographic service area. So you can't do the same population, program, and service area. That's double dipping. So as long as you're not double dipping, you can apply for more than one opportunity.
And a few folks have asked about Family First Act, and is Youth Collaboratory facilitating any help with those? And for those of you interested, feel free to submit a request through our website, and we can see if we have a review team with that expertise.
Great, thanks, Shelley. The full amount of YHEP available for all 3 rounds. We do know what that total number is, but how many communities that will end up funding is can be drastically different because it is based on the population and the size of the city. So for example, a Chicago applicant would get significantly more money than a smaller rural applicant. So I don't know the answer in terms of number of awards. I'm going to pass it off to you. I'm going to pause there, Chris, and pass it off to you to start doing the what to expect in COVID relief, and I'll attempt to answer some of these other questions directly in the chat, just so we make sure we hit everything.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, we've talked about funding outcomes for FY21, including the COVID relief to date. We're going to talk about what to expect moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 big ticket items that Congress is working on. In order, they will be COVID relief, also now called the American Rescue Act, FY22 appropriations. Think about keeping the lights on. That's the regular process of funding government, and then a stimulus bill. And when we say stimulus bill, again, that's economic recovery / infrastructure. Next slide. Here we go. All right, just a quick summary, a little frame setting of where we are to date on COVID relief. Congress has passed 5 COVID-related relief bills. The first 3 were in March. Then there was a 4th, a Paycheck Protection Program, a PPP supplemental in April, and then the COVID Relief Act this past December. In all told, Congress has so far allocated about $3.5 trillion with a T, $3.5 trillion in relief related to COVID. Next slide. Within that funding so far, Youth Collaboratory has been advocating along with our peers and partners to support youth and young people who are experiencing homelessness. There has not been a lot, for those who are interested in youth mentoring grants, there has not been a lot of focus on youth mentoring grants within Congress, just given the health crisis, though there may be more opportunity moving forward. But in this past year, it has been mostly about ensuring that folks are sheltered and separated and can socially distance in a manner that cuts down on transmission of COVID. So within these 3.5 trillion, we were successful in securing an additional 25 million for RY in the CARES Act in March, an additional 4 billion in emergency solutions grants, ESG, that's administered by HUD, with a number of flexibilities that were included in the March CARES Relief Act. And I believe someone could put the link. Youth Collaboratory and our peers developed guidance for ESG local administrators on how to use those flexibilities that were provided with these $4 billion to better serve youth and young people who may be experiencing homelessness or who are at risk for homelessness. And if you are working with that population, we encourage you to take a look at this guidance and to provide it to your local ESG administrators so that they may make use of it and appropriately tap these dollars for youth and young people. In addition, I'll just go back, 25 billion was included in the December COVID relief bill, 25 billion for rental assistance. And in December, they extended the eviction moratorium that was first enacted in March and then extended in this most recent bill in December. And Youth Collaboratory has been supportive of all of these efforts. All right, what to expect moving forward. The American Rescue Act is a 1.9 trillion package that is currently being negotiated. It is in the House at the moment. The House committees are marking that up and putting it together into a single package in which it will be brought to the floor for a vote. It is almost certain to pass, though the Democrats who control the House have very, very narrow margins. And then it will go to the Senate, in which they will have to use reconciliation, which we mentioned earlier, in order to bypass the Senate's filibuster. I know it's a lot. The filibuster is the 60-vote threshold that is typically required to pass legislation. Using reconciliation, Congress can pass it with just 50 votes in the Senate. And that's the key difference. It allows the Democrats to pass COVID relief, this $1.9 trillion package, without any Senate Republican support. But it also means they cannot enact any substantive policy changes. They can only spend money or change tax code or debt issues. They can't enact new policy changes. And that is a rule around reconciliation. Otherwise, it would become a more typical piece of legislation. All right, the components that are under consideration in the American Rescue Act, this $1.9 trillion. Under housing, there's $19 billion for rental assistance. This is in addition to the $25 billion that was allocated in December. $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers. Those are housing choice vouchers, Section 8, tenant-based vouchers. $5 billion through the home program, also at HUD, to assist people who are homeless with immediate and long-term assistance. And then about $10 billion for homeowner assistance, about $5 billion for utility assistance, and $100 million for housing counseling. Obviously, that's only 45, what is that, 50 billion out of a $1.9 trillion package. There's a lot. A number of other components that are being considered, big ticket components, but under the housing, these are the most relevant. For folks who are tracking this package, the other components that are large are the direct payments, $1,400 to all qualifying individuals, extensions of the unemployment, pandemic unemployment assistance, that would be $400 per week, federal minimum wage, raising it to $15 an hour, $350 billion in state and local assistance, expanded child and earned income tax credits, child care funding, broadband. I mean, there's a number of priorities that are being included in this American Rescue Package that is currently under negotiation. Okay, the relief timeline for this current package, Congress is going to attempt to pass it before March 14th. Why March 14th? Because that's when the unemployment benefits expire. They want to make sure that there's no lapse in pandemic unemployment assistance. What that means is the House needs to vote by next week, and that's tight. And then it has to go over to the Senate, and they have to deal with that whole reconciliation thing that I keep talking about. And that's a very complicated parliamentary process. So it's going to be tight, but that is what Congress is attempting to do. We should expect to see something by mid-March or late March, possibly. All right, that was the first big ticket item. The second big ticket item is FY22 appropriations, keeping the lights on. This is the trillion plus spending that Congress does every year. The skinny version of the president's budget request should be released any day now. Skinny meaning like the scaled down, quick and dirty version of the budget. But that will kickstart the FY22 process. So, Congress has got to walk, chew gum, and juggle flaming swords at the same time. It's a little bit convoluted up here at the moment, but we're going to jump right into the appropriations process almost simultaneous to COVID relief. I never waste an opportunity to talk process. This is my own little personal, you can't affect the outcome, such as appropriations and funding, if you don't understand the process. So I always like to add 1 or 2 slides in this presentation about the budget and appropriation cycle. I think it's helpful to understand. But if we started the circle here, top left, the start of the fiscal year on October 1, this is what an annual year would look like when we talk about budget and appropriations. So during the summer and the fall, federal agencies and the Office of Management and Budget, that's the White House, come up with what their budget request is going to be. The president's budget, the request to Congress, is released in February. Bottom of the circle, congressional committees do their budgets. And then in April through really sometimes August or even September, Congress will go through the appropriations process by which they actually allocate dollars. And then by the time we're back into August, September, October, the federal agencies and OMB are back to developing the next fiscal year's budget request. So this is sort of the continuous cycle that happens all the time in the background. Okay. We may be missing, we could do one more click here. Yeah, president's budget requests. All right, this is the approach cycle. This is that March to September process. The president's budget request comes out, then the House and the Senate divide, and they work on 2 identical processes simultaneously, where they come up with their own budgets, they mark up their own spending bills, they vote on them, and then, if we have one more click, they will merge them in a process called conference committee. And ideally, that process is done by October 1 and sent to the president for his signature or veto. It doesn't always work that way. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, last year we didn't get our FY21 appropriations until December instead of by September 30th or October 1. But theoretically, this is the process. And I will, in the next slide, talk about why it's important to have these in mind. February, March, and April are the best times to begin engaging in advocacy. Advocacy needs to happen early, it needs to happen often. If you're not in the conversation at the start of that process, then you're not going to be able to impact the outcome. If you're not talking to your members of Congress in February, March, and April, then by the time September rolls around, the cake is baked. Or while there may be some changes, they're going to say, well, where were you in April when we were putting this thing together? So, I always am inclined to reinforce the importance of communicating your community's needs and educating your members of Congress on what's going on and what federal programs, these big, massive programs, we're talking about billions of dollars here, but they have very meaningful impacts for you and the people you serve. And if you don't communicate it, then who will? So all advocacy is local, and members of Congress, believe it or not, do respond to local needs. And I always encourage folks to make your advocacy local. Go up, you can't go up to Congress anymore because of COVID, but call your member of Congress, get them on a Zoom, talk to staff, and tell them what's working for you or what's not. And that is something that we all should be engaged in as these billions of dollars roll out. Okay, that was the first two. We talked about the COVID relief, FY22 appropriations, keeping the lights on. The third big ticket item and what to expect, a stimulus bill, an infrastructure and economic recovery package. This is the Christmas tree of DC spending bills. Infrastructure bills in this town are always Christmas trees. They are adorned with ornaments and pet projects and all sorts of things. I wouldn't expect an infrastructure bill to be this year any difference. It may be a little more streamlined in that they are very deliberately trying to juice the economy. The Democrats who control the White House, the Senate and the House, have a real fear of doing too little to restart the economy. This goes back all the way to the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, 2011. And for those folks who remember the American Recovery Act, where we put in $800 billion into the economy, that was in retrospect viewed as not enough to merge the gap. And we saw a steady but slow recovery from the Great Recession. The lesson that the Democrats have taken from that, for right or wrong, I'm just giving you their perspective, is that they are afraid of doing too little as they did back in 2009, 2010. And they want to make sure that COVID relief, the 1.9 that is currently being debated, and then this forthcoming stimulus bill are sufficient to get us on a robust and quick recovery. So that's the political calculus that is sort of in the back of the mind here. What exactly this infrastructure and economic recovery package will look like, hard to say at this stage. We will expect that there will be a substantial infrastructure expenditure because that's one of the key components. But beyond that, there's going to be a lot of room to advocate and to discuss. Obviously, it will reflect the Biden economic philosophy to a great degree. And there was an excellent New York Times Magazine article that came out maybe a couple of days ago. So hopefully somebody can drop the link here in the chat. If you have time to read it or to listen to it, I think there's an audio version. I recommend it. It's a nice insight into the evolution of the president and his current economic philosophy. I listened to it and I found it insightful. Okay, so in summary, COVID relief, currently under negotiation, 1.9 trillion. FY22 appropes, I'm guessing 1.2 trillion. That's ballpark where it's been. And that's appropriations is everything except for mandatory spending. So, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, labor, education, agriculture, HUD, it's everything except Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, some spending on the debt, things of that nature. So 1.2 trillion for appropes, and then maybe 1 to 2 trillion for the economic recovery and infrastructure package that will be forthcoming. So those are the three big ticket items to keep in mind in the next, 1 to call it 10 months.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I am just briefly going to talk about Youth Collaboratory membership and advocacy in case for those of you who are less familiar with Youth Collaboratory and want more information on how they can get involved in some of what Chris was sharing. So for anyone who's considering the services that I reviewed earlier, I'd highly encourage you to become a Youth Collaboratory member. The discounts that you will receive on those services alone is well beyond the membership investment. Members receive a 25% discount on our public webinars and up to 25% off all of our training and consulting services, which includes those grant development services that I discussed earlier. And then lastly, members have access for opportunities for subcontracts. So when Youth Collaboratory receives grants related to innovation, research, implementation, we first subcontract with our membership. Membership is also how our advocacy work is funded. So the work that we are doing here with Chris today and throughout the year. So if any of the funding sources that he identified are critical to your organization, we offer a very affordable way to contribute to the sustainability and growth of those funding sources. We also keep our members up to date on funding, providing insider information from federal agencies throughout the year and equipping them with easy tools and messaging to help build relationships with their representatives on the Hill. So you can learn more about Youth Collaboratory membership by clicking on the link provided. Yep, we threw it into the chat box. And last thing I just want to share is the advocacy work within our membership those benefits include having a dedicated, experienced team working year-round to advance your priorities, the work that is important to you. There's also access to our public policy office hours, our policy discussions with members, and the opportunity to be involved with our work directly on the Hill. And also includes policy updates and alerts. So we are doing a lot of that coordination and legwork to make it easy for you. For those of you who already have relationships, we also provide support in the context of these things that are your priority. Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you to briefly go through a few resources before we open it up for questions.
Thanks, Megan. Just to recirculate this again, to find and apply for grants, for those who would like a refresher or maybe a quick overview, Youth Collab's how-to page is useful. This next resource, I am always, for those folks who are interested, if we click once more, interested in DC's, what's going on here, tracking federal policy, politics, and don't know where to turn. This is what I read in the morning. I've been a lobbyist for 13 years. Punchbowl News is a new startup. I have no connection with them other than I followed these 4 reporters for the last decade plus, and they're excellent. So if you'd like to stay abreast of what's going on in DC and you're looking for a recommendation, this is my recommendation for news. Obviously, there are lots of good sources out there. And then for those folks who, like policy and want to understand more but don't know where to turn, there are primers on every single federal policy through the Congressional Research Service. CRS reports are produced and have been for, I think, almost a century, primarily for Hill staffers, but last year they made them public. There's not a lot of press around it, but you can go to the CRS reports website and look up whatever policy you're curious about. And you can find a primer somewhere usually between 3 to 20 pages on whatever federal policy you're interested in. And I am a big proponent of demystifying DC and making as many resources accessible to the public as possible. I use CRS reports all the time. If there's something new that I am unfamiliar with, an issue I'm unfamiliar with, or I want to double check on how a formula works or the history behind some policy, CRS reports is a great go-to to wrap your mind around federal policy. So I highly recommend it. Make use of it. It's a federally available public resource. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Chris. So the next thing we're going to do is open it up for any remaining questions. I see there's one question that I'm going to pass off to you, Chris. While we are answering those questions, for those of you who don't have any questions, you can open up the evaluation link that we're going to put into the chat box here. Take 2 to 3 minutes to give us some feedback while also staying connected to hear other folks' questions. So you can click on that link and fill out the evaluation without losing your connection. So you can go ahead and get started on that now while we open up for questions. So like we said, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat. If you would like to answer or ask your question live, if there's more context attached to it, you can also unmute and ask your question that way as well. So, and I would say that we're happy to take any and all questions, and we will I know we've answered some throughout here. We'll continue to answer them as long as time permits. So Chris, first question from the chat that still hasn't been answered comes from Aaron. Aaron asks, is there any value in reaching out to Republican members of Congress in terms of advocacy?
Yes, absolutely, always. Our issues are nonpartisan. They're not just bipartisan, they're nonpartisan. Helping youth and young people is not a partisan issue, and it doesn't matter what side of the aisle someone is on. They should understand the role the federal government has in supporting young people in the United States. And right now, the Democrats have the levers of power, but that changes. And it is not a one-party rule here in DC, and it never will be. And there is always value in educating members across the aisle on all of our issues. And there have been many Republicans who have been very supportive of these issues over the years. So yes, please talk to all and every member of Congress.
Mm-hmm. Great. Other questions? Chris, I see Margaret is asking, what is happening with the reauthorization of RHY TPA?
So our RHY TPA was partially reauthorized at the end of 2018. Youth Collaboratory was supportive at that time. It did not, unfortunately, include the programmatic changes that I know many of us would have liked to see. It was part of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention reauthorization. It was sort of rolled in. I can't say for certain what's going to happen with that. It is up for reauthorization again after only 2 or 3 short years. And there are changes that we would like to see. I know the field as a whole would like to see some programmatic changes. Whether or not that gets addressed this year or in the next 2 years is a bit to be determined. As you've kind of seen that Congress has their hands full at the moment. But maybe they could walk, chew gum, juggle, and ride a unicycle at the same time. They kind of need to. So I'm sorry, I don't have a firm answer as to whether or not it will move this year.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. I always like hearing you come up with more things that Congress is going to do. At the same time, I look forward to what they'll be doing over the next hour. Williams asks, can you explain the different level of memberships with Youth Collaboratory? Yes, I'm happy to explain the different levels of membership. So there's a base level membership, level 1. You get the same benefits regardless of the level of investment. We offer folks a variety of levels so that we can allow folks who are smaller organizations with limited budgets to continue to be members with Youth Collaboratory, and those who have a larger budget or have more of a demand on the advocacy or the other work that we do, if they would like to make a larger investment or have a larger organizational interest in that work, they can invest at a higher level, so going all the way up to a level 5. Margaret asks, what about the Emergency Family Stabilization Act? Is it in any of the current COVID relief?
So the Emergency Family Stabilization Act has been introduced by Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. It's a bipartisan bill. It would allocate about $800 million in a one-time investment to HHS. This is for folks who are unfamiliar with it, to provide some COVID-related relief to existing ACF, that's Administration for Children and Families grantees. As far as I know, it is not included in the House reconciliation package that they've been putting together. I have not seen it included in the 1.9 trillion that's been discussed so far. That said, it's in the House currently, and then that package will have to go over to the Senate, in which it will be played with. The more they play with it, the more difficult it is to pass. So I wouldn't anticipate that it is included, but it's not ruled out.
Great, thanks. And then Chris, if you can see in the chat the question from Daphne related to ESG funding. From what Daphne understands, the ESG funding from the CARES Act is set to expire in December. Are funds from the American Rescue Act earmarked specifically for ESG that would go beyond December that you are aware of?
Sure. So the dollars that are allocated in the Rescue Act are not ESG dollars. They are rental assistance. They are through the HOME program, which is a sister program to ESG, but they are not new ESG dollars. They sort of are run in parallel to the ESG funding that was provided in CARES. As to the expiration of those ESG funds, I would have to double check if that is being extended. I don't believe so. I know that about $2 and change billion has been drawn down, and I anticipate that HUD is trying to move the rest of that $4 billion out as needed by communities. But the American Rescue Act funding, that 40 or so billion that I talked about earlier, that is not through ESG, that is through other parallel programs.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chris. And I would just remind folks that if you have questions, or if we're answering a question and you have more context, you can always unmute yourself or continue to plug them here into the chat box. So Terrell asks, was it correct that the YHDP RFP will be released in March sometime? Terrell, we never know exactly when these funding announcements are going to be released. That depends on a variety of, in fact, most people don't know exactly when they're going to be released until they're actually scheduled and all of the sign-offs have been completed. So I anticipate that we can say that we anticipate that it would be coming out later in the later this spring. I know that they were working on it last year. So with the new administration, it's anybody's guess on how long it will actually take before it comes out. But typically those are, the whole review process is done by the summertime. So hopefully soon.
And I will add something onto that, Megan. Youth Collab and our peers, we were successful in, excuse me, solving a technical problem with the rounds $4 and $5. I know we've all been anxiously awaiting that funding, and it was coming up on the expiration of the authority for HUD to spend those funds. So we were successful in extending that authority primarily for the purpose so that recipients of rounds 4 and 5, when they do come out, will have the full planning period that other YHDP communities have received. And otherwise, without that technical fix, folks would have been much more compressed. So we were pleased to see that be a success in this past year.
Mm-hmm. Angela is saying YHDP round 4 is for 75 million and round 5 is for 70 million, correct? I know we've gone over these numbers ad nauseum. Do you remember off the top of your head, Chris?
I do. So the appropriations were a bit higher. There's a little bit of money carved out for training and technical assistance. Round 4 is 75 million, round 5 is 70 million, and round 6 is 72 million to be allocated. So what is that? Well, you know, 170. Oh, I don't know. Somebody else. I was a poli-sci major.
Yeah, and Chris, the difference, so for example, you said round 6 is how many? How many?
72, millions? I believe it's
72.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that the difference between 72 and then what we have in the slide, which is 82, is the amount of the award, the amount of the funding that is dedicated to technical assistance or other work that does not go directly to the grantees. Yeah.
Yes, that is correct. So the total appropriation was 82 million this past year, of which 72 will be allocated through the grant program, and then the other 10 will be allocated to support dissemination and best practices throughout the country.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Dawn came through the calculator reel or in their head at 217 million for a total.
Thank you.
Chris, there was a question here earlier from Faith, who asked the question, what would be your approach when seeking out local government officials for funding? I'm unclear if this goes back to your comment about all advocacy being local.
Well, I'd say there's two sides of that. One, it's always good to know your members of Congress, your local public officials, because they too talk with your members of Congress. And we at Spinnaker here have a couple of philosophies of advocacy, and one of which is all advocacy is local, and then another one is all advocacy is intergovernmental. So yes, talk to your sheriff, talk to your city council and your town council and your governor and your state senators and members. But when it comes to funding, if you're talking about pass-through funding, if you are looking at, for example, the 21st Century Community Learning Program provides enrichment activities out of school hours. Those are awarded by formula to the states, which then state education agencies, I believe, which then subgrant them to local education agencies and nonprofits. If you were in the, interested in working with youth after school, then I would start that process early. Take a look at when that funding comes out, when it's given to the states, and make those contacts with the state or with your local LEA or whomever before the funding comes out. You want to be written into applications, or you want them to have you in mind as the funding is rolling out. So that would be my advice when talking about sort of pass-through federal dollars.
Hi, Christopher, this is Faith, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the name of the funding for the enrichment?
Sure, it's the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, 21st CCLC. And I think it's about 1.6 billion every year allocated to all 50 states. And I just picked that as a random example of federal funding that is typically, goes to the states first and then is eventually often in the hands of nonprofits at the local level.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Any other questions that we can be helpful with before we sign off today?
Any questions are fair game. I can't guarantee I can answer it, but there are no bad questions.
Hi, this is Anne. I was wondering if there's any technical assistance available for our COC for the YHGP that Youth Collaboratory offers.
That is a great question. So Youth Collaboratory is a TA provider for the YHGP, for current YHGP grantees. And being that we can't, we keep a separation between the folks who do that technical assistance and any sort of webinars and support that have to do with federal funding, so that we're not crossing any sort of insider information. So what I would say to that is that Youth Collaboratory can always provide technical assistance to their communities related to much of the information that is already online for folks to be able to access. So as members, I would encourage you to reach out to your point of contact with any questions you have related to any of those components that you see online that you're looking to strengthen. So to be more specific, we may not be able to give you direct feedback in your grant application, but we can certainly help you and guide you to resources and provide other support on strengthening areas that you are looking to strengthen.
All right,
Does that
thank
make
you.
sense, Anne? Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Let's see. Jennifer says, can you give an example of grants for homeless services coming up, especially emergency housing and transitional housing? Jennifer, I'll let Chris chime in on this too, but the two primary sources for that are through HUD, which covers a larger homelessness population, and then through HHS, the Family and Youth Services Bureau, which covers young people under the age of, it depends on your program, generally under the age of 18. Chris, anything that you would add to that?
Sure. In the rescue package, so the one that's currently being debated, I mentioned the emergency vouchers that have, so all of these things sort of have flexibility. So it depends on, I think you said transitional living programs, but before that you mentioned something else. Sorry, I couldn't quite catch that. But just in quick summary, 19 billion for emergency rental assistance, 5 billion for the for emergency vouchers, 5 billion for the home program, and that can be tenant-based rental assistance, development of affordable housing, supportive services, acquisition of non-congregate shelters, a portion of which may be diverted to permanent affordable housing, kept as non-congregate shelters or used as an emergency shelter. So there's some, that's almost some capital dollars there, as well as the homeowner assistance and utility assistance. In addition, there are still unspent ESG dollars from the CARES Act in March. So there is still money there. And that original 4 billion, of which some of it has already been allocated, has an incredible wealth of flexibilities. There's, I would encourage you to look at the guidance that we linked to earlier and talk to your local ESG administrator if you want to try and access some of those funds to meet your local needs. When Congress allocated that back in March, it's hard to think back that far, but really it was when that CARES Act bill came together, it came together in 5 days. They spent 2.2 trillion in 5 days. It really took 10 because they were figuring out the unemployment, but most of that stuff came together in 5 days. And what they were really trying to do was push out money to get folks out of congregate care, to slow the spread, and to give waivers to meet whatever the local needs were. I would encourage you to take a look at the guidance that we produced with Away Home America and True Colors United and the Alliance to End Homelessness, and then talk to your local ESG administrator. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's all the questions that I see in the chat. So I would give it one more minute in case folks have any last burning questions before we wrap it up. While I'm giving it that minute, I will just point out in the slides that you have the contact information for myself and Chris, general contact information for Youth Collaboratory. A number of folks have asked the question around the recording or the slides for this. So if you haven't joined our mailing list, the link is in the chat box. That's the best way to get the link once it is posted to our website. And then if we could also put the evaluation link back in the chat box for folks that haven't had a chance to fill out that evaluation link, if you could take a minute to fill that out as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap for the day. Thank you all so much for participating. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Check out our website, sign up for the mailing list. And if you want those proposal review services, I can't stress how important it is to sign up for that right away. So thank you all for your time today. Have a great afternoon.